A poor single dad took in strange twin girls for one night, unaware their father is a millionaire. To the single parent listening right now, before we continue, let this remind you, you are not failing. You are fighting. You are brave, you are not alone, and your child is lucky to have you. And for my lovely viewers, your kindness, your time, your quiet strength, it all matters here. You're part of this story too. The doorbell's chime cut through the storm's roar like a knife through silence. Jake Sullivan froze at his kitchen table, his trembling hands still gripping the electricity bill marked "Final Notice" in angry red ink. The clock on his microwave glowed 9:47 p.m. Who could possibly be at his door at this hour? Especially in weather like this? Thunder crashed overhead with such violence that it seemed to shake the very foundation of his modest duplex on Maple Street. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the front door cautiously. Through the peephole, he could barely make out two figures huddled against the storm, young women with blonde hair plastered to their heads, shoulders hunched against the relentless downpour. In this neighborhood, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. Jake had learned that lesson the hard way over the past 3 years. But something about their posture, the way they held each other, looking more lost than threatening, stirred something deep in his chest. Something paternal. Something that reminded him of. He opened the door just a crack, leaving the chain latch engaged. "Can I help you?" The taller of the two women looked up, and Jake felt his breath catch. Her blue eyes were filled with such raw desperation that it physically hurt to look at them. "Please, sir, we're so sorry to bother you. Our car broke down about a mile from here, and we've been walking in this storm. We've knocked on every door on this street, but no one will help us. We just need to use your phone to call for help." Jake studied their faces in the dim porch light. They couldn't be much older than 20, with identical features that marked them clearly as twins. But it was their eyes that got to him, wide, frightened, desperate. They reminded him so much of his 6-year-old Sophie when she'd wake up from a nightmare, needing her daddy to make the world safe again. "We tried calling our insurance company," the second twin added, her voice shaking so badly Jake could barely understand her. "But the storm knocked out the cell towers, and we don't have any cash for a taxi or hotel. We've been walking for hours. Please, we just need help." Jake's practical mind screamed warnings. He didn't know these girls. They could be running some kind of scam. In his old life, back when he lived in the suburbs behind gates and security systems, he might have called the police and let them handle it. But looking at them now, really looking, he saw something that overrode every logical concern. He saw his own children. Danny, now 8 years old, living 3,000 miles away in Oregon. Sophie, 6, whose bedtime stories Jake now told over crackling phone connections twice a week if he was lucky. What if they were ever stranded somewhere, scared and alone? What if they needed help and everyone turned them away? "Hold on," Jake said, his voice rougher than he intended. He closed the door to unhook the chain, and when he opened it again, the full fury of the storm hit him like a physical blow. Rain drove horizontally across his porch, soaking him instantly. "Come in. Get out of this weather." The relief that washed over both girls' faces was so profound, so overwhelming, that Jake felt tears prick his own eyes. "Thank you," they said almost in unison, stepping into his humble living room. "Thank you so much. We were starting to think we'd have to spend the night in our car." Jake grabbed 2 towels from the bathroom, trying not to feel embarrassed about their threadbare condition. Everything in his duplex showed the wear of a man barely scraping by. The wallpaper peeled in places, the heating system wheezed like an old man climbing stairs, and the furniture was mostly second-hand finds from garage sales. "Here, dry off," he said, handing them the towels. "I'm Jake, by the way." "I'm Amanda," said the taller twin, accepting the towel like it was made of gold. "And this is my sister, Samantha. We can't thank you enough. We really thought we might freeze out there." "Where's your car now?" Jake asked, closing the door against the howling wind that seemed determined to tear his house apart. "About a mile north, on Cedar Avenue," Samantha replied, toweling her blonde hair dry. "It just started making this awful grinding noise and died. We're not from around here, we were just—" She caught herself, glancing at her sister with an expression Jake couldn't quite read. "We were looking at houses for a friend." Jake noticed the exchange but didn't press. Cedar Avenue wasn't exactly the kind of neighborhood where people went house shopping, especially not girls who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. But everyone had their secrets, and he respected privacy more than most. "Cedar Avenue's not a great area to be stranded at night," he said gently. "You did the right thing leaving the car and looking for help." As the twins dried off, Jake couldn't help but notice details that didn't quite add up. Their clothes, though soaked, were clearly expensive. Designer red gowns that probably cost more than his monthly electric bill. Leather boots that looked handcrafted. Coats that screamed high-end boutique. What were girls like these doing in his rundown neighborhood at nearly 10 o'clock at night? The phone's in the kitchen if you want to try calling for help, he offered, pushing his curiosity aside. Whatever their story, they were clearly in genuine distress. Amanda tried the landline, pressing buttons and holding the receiver to her ear with growing frustration. The storm must have knocked out the phone lines too, she said, her shoulders sagging with defeat. Jake felt that familiar tug in his chest, the same protective instinct that had once driven him to work 18-hour days, trying to build a future for his own family. The instinct that had ultimately cost him everything he held dear. But tonight, that instinct whispered only one thing: help them. Look, he said, the words coming out before he could second-guess himself. You can't go anywhere in this weather. The forecast said this storm's supposed to last all night. You're welcome to stay here until morning. The twins exchanged glances, and Jake could see the internal debate playing out on their faces. Trust a stranger or brave the storm, neither option was particularly appealing for two young women alone. We don't want to impose, Samantha said carefully, her voice carrying a cultured accent that spoke of private schools and country clubs. You've already done so much for us. You're not imposing, Jake assured them, managing a self-deprecating smile. I have a couch that pulls out into a bed. It's not the Ritz-Carlton, but it's dry and warm. He paused, suddenly self-conscious about his humble surroundings. Though I should warn you, the breakfast menu is pretty limited. I think I have some cereal and maybe some bread for toast. For the first time since they'd arrived, both girls smiled, real smiles that transformed their faces completely. That sounds absolutely wonderful, Amanda said, and something in her tone suggested she meant it more than politeness required. As Jake helped them settle in, pulling sheets and blankets from his linen closet, he found himself drawn into conversation. The twins were articulate and engaging, with a warmth that gradually began to fill the empty spaces in his house. They asked about his work, his life, the neighborhood. Usually, Jake avoided personal topics. The pain was still too raw, too immediate. But something about their genuine interest made him open up in ways he hadn't in years. I'm an architect, he found himself saying as he made them hot chocolate with the last of his cocoa powder, the mug warming his cold hands. Well, I was. Now I mostly do freelance drafting work when I can find it. That sounds fascinating, Samantha said, settling onto his worn couch with her hands wrapped around the steaming mug. What kind of buildings did you design? Jake's throat tightened as memories flooded back. Commercial mostly. Office buildings, shopping centers. I had my own firm for a while. He didn't mention how that firm had consumed his life, how his obsession with success had blinded him to what really mattered. What happened to it? Amanda asked gently, then immediately looked stricken. Sorry, that's probably too personal. You don't have to answer. It's okay, Jake said, surprised by his own willingness to share. The storm outside seemed to create a bubble of intimacy, making confessions feel safe. My life kind of fell apart 3 years ago. Divorce, business partnership dissolved, had to sell everything just to pay the lawyers. He thought about stopping there, but something in their eyes, a compassion that seemed far beyond their years, encouraged him to continue. I have 2 kids, he said quietly, the words scraping his throat raw. Danny's 8 now, Sophie's 6. They live with their mother in Oregon. The twins' expressions shifted, becoming impossibly gentle. That must be incredibly hard, Samantha said softly. Being so far from them. Jake's vision blurred as emotion crashed over him like the storm outside. Yeah, it is. I call them twice a week, but it's not the same as being there. I miss everything, soccer games, school plays, bedtime stories. Last week, Sophie lost her first tooth, and I had to hear about it 3 days later in a 5-minute phone call. His voice cracked on the last words, and he turned away, embarrassed by his display of emotion in front of these young strangers. What happened? Amanda asked with infinite gentleness. With your wife, I mean. Jake took a shaky breath. Rebecca said I was never there. That I cared more about building my business than building memories with my family. She wasn't wrong. I thought I was providing for them, securing their future, but I was missing their present. By the time I realized what I was losing, it was too late. The pain in his voice seemed to fill the small room, mixing with the sound of rain against the windows like tears against glass. She moved to Oregon for a fresh start, Jake continued, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. said she needed to get away from all the memories. The court gave her primary custody. I see Danny and Sophie during summer breaks and alternating holidays, when I can afford the plane ticket. How often is that? Samantha asked, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. This year might be the first time I miss summer, Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Work's been slow, and the custody lawyer fees ate up most of my savings. I've been trying to put money aside, but... He gestured helplessly at the pile of bills on his kitchen table. The twins listened with a level of empathy that seemed impossible for their age. They asked thoughtful questions, shared stories of their own childhood, and gradually, Jake felt some of the crushing loneliness that had become his constant companion begin to ease. You know what strikes me about your story? Amanda said after a long moment of comfortable silence. You're still fighting for them. Even when everything fell apart, even when it would be easier to give up, you're still trying to be their father. They're my whole world, Jake said simply. Even if I can't be with them every day, I want them to know their dad never stopped loving them, never stopped trying. As the evening wore on, Jake learned that Amanda and Samantha had grown up in Connecticut, that they were both 22 and recent college graduates. They spoke fondly of their childhood but remained vague about their family circumstances, mentioning only that their father was in business and deflecting when Jake asked for specifics. He sensed there was much more to their story, but he respected their privacy. After all, he was a stranger who'd taken them in for the night. They didn't owe him their life stories. You know, Amanda said as Jake prepared the pull-out couch with his best sheets, we've stayed in some pretty fancy hotels over the years, but I don't think I've ever felt as welcome anywhere as I do right here. That's very kind of you to say, Jake replied, tucking the sheets around the thin mattress. But I'm sure you're just being polite about my humble accommodations. No, really, Samantha insisted, her voice carrying a sincerity that made Jake look up from his work. It's not about the place, it's about the person. You opened your door to complete strangers in the middle of a storm. You shared your food, your home, your story. Not many people would do that. I have kids, he said simply, the truth of it settling in his chest like a warm ember. If Danny and Sophie were ever stranded somewhere, scared and alone, I'd hope someone would help them. I'd pray someone would see past their own fears and just be kind. As they settled in for the night, the twins whispering softly to each other on the pull-out couch, Jake lay in his own bed listening to the storm gradually losing its fury outside. For the first time in months, his small duplex didn't feel empty. The soft murmur of voices, the knowledge that he'd helped someone, the simple human connection, it all reminded him of better times when his house had been filled with family sounds and laughter. He drifted off to sleep thinking about kindness, about the strange twists of fate that had brought these two young women to his door, and about how sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can feel like the most important things in the world. The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the storm had washed the world clean and started everything fresh. Jake woke early, as was his habit developed from years of trying to squeeze more hours into each day. He found both twins already awake, sitting at his kitchen table and speaking in hushed, urgent tones that stopped the moment they saw him. Good morning, he said, offering them coffee in his mismatched mugs. How did you sleep? Better than we have in weeks, Amanda said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Something in her tone suggested she meant more than just physical rest. After a simple breakfast of toast and the last of his orange juice, Jake offered to drive them back to their car. The twins accepted, though he noticed they seemed strangely reluctant to leave, exchanging meaningful glances he couldn't interpret. During the short drive through his neighborhood, now peaceful in the morning sunlight, they were quieter than they'd been the night before. Jake caught them looking at him in ways that made him self-conscious, as if they were memorizing his face. Their car sat exactly where they'd left it on Cedar Avenue, a sleek BMW with Connecticut plates that looked even more out of place in the rundown neighborhood in daylight. Jake popped the hood and examined the engine, his construction experience coming in handy. Your alternator belt snapped, he diagnosed, pointing to the problem. It's an easy fix, but you'll need to have it towed to a shop. Shouldn't be too expensive. The twins called their insurance company on Jake's phone, and within an hour, a tow truck arrived. As they prepared to leave with the driver, Amanda pressed something into Jake's hand, a business card with elegant embossed lettering. If you ever need anything, she said, her blue eyes unusually bright with emotion. Anything at all, please call this number. Jake glanced at the card without really focusing on it, too caught up in the strange sadness of saying goodbye to these two young women who had briefly brought light into his dark world. Thank you, he said, pocketing the card. Take care of yourselves. Drive safely. As the tow truck disappeared around the corner, Taking Amanda and Samantha with it, Jake felt the familiar weight of loneliness settle back on his shoulders like a heavy coat. The brief interlude of companionship was over, and he was back to his reality of unpaid bills, empty rooms, and the crushing worry about whether he'd see his children this summer. But something had changed. Some small spark of hope had been rekindled in those few hours of human connection. For the first time in months, Jake felt like maybe, just maybe, he could keep going. For the next 2 weeks, Jake threw himself into his work with renewed energy. He finally landed a small commercial project, designing renovations for a local restaurant, that would help him catch up on some bills and maybe, if he was careful with every penny, put aside enough for a plane ticket to Oregon. He thought about Amanda and Samantha occasionally, wondering if they'd made it home safely, but the demands of daily survival soon pushed them to the background of his mind. The business card sat forgotten in his jeans pocket, going through the wash twice before he finally pulled it out and set it on his dresser. Then, on a Tuesday morning that started like any other, everything changed. Jake was hunched over his drafting table, pencil in hand, carefully measuring angles for the restaurant renovation, when his doorbell rang. He glanced at the clock, 10:30 a.m. Probably a delivery or maybe Mrs. Henderson from next door wanting to borrow something again. He opened the door and froze. Standing on his doorstep was a man in an expensive suit that probably cost more than Jake's monthly rent, flanked by Amanda and Samantha Sterling. But it wasn't their presence that made Jake's knees go weak, it was the way they stood together, the unmistakable family resemblance, the aura of wealth and power that surrounded the older man like cologne. "Mr. Sullivan," the man said, extending a manicured hand with a warm smile. "My name is Robert Sterling. I believe you've met my daughters." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with stunning, overwhelming clarity. The expensive clothes on 2 girls stranded in his neighborhood. The vague answers about their family. The business card he'd barely glanced at. Amanda Sterling. "You're their father," Jake managed, his voice coming out as barely more than a whisper. "I am," Robert Sterling said, his grip firm and reassuring. "And I understand I owe you a debt of gratitude that I can never fully repay." Amanda stepped forward, her eyes already filling with tears. "We told him everything, Jake. How you were the only person who helped us that night. How you opened your home to complete strangers. How kind you were even though you had so little to give." "Dad wanted to come sooner," Samantha added quickly, "but we asked him to wait. We needed to be sure about something first." Jake's head was spinning. The world seemed to tilt sideways as he tried to process what was happening. Sure about what? Robert Sterling's smile widened, and Jake could see where his daughters had inherited their warmth and genuine nature. "My daughters are excellent judges of character, Mr. Sullivan. They insisted on doing some research before we approached you." "Research?" Jake asked, confusion and growing alarm warring in his chest. "About your children," Amanda said softly, her voice gentle but direct. "About your custody situation, your financial struggles, your career background. Everything you shared with us that night." Jake felt heat flood his face. His private struggles, his failures, his desperate financial situation, it had all been investigated, catalogued, probably discussed in boardrooms and family meetings. The humiliation was crushing. "Please don't be angry," Samantha said quickly, seeing his expression change. "We weren't trying to invade your privacy. We wanted to help. The way you helped us." "Help?" Jake's voice cracked. "I don't understand what's happening here." Robert Sterling stepped forward, his expression serious but kind. "Mr. Sullivan, I'm the CEO of Sterling Development Group. We specialize in commercial and residential construction projects across the Northeast. I've reviewed your architectural portfolio, what I could find of it, and I'm genuinely impressed by your work." Jake gripped the doorframe, his knees threatening to give out. "I still don't understand." "What I'm about to offer you," Robert said carefully, "is not charity. It's not pity. It's good business mixed with the recognition of exceptional character. My company is expanding, and we need talented architects who understand that buildings aren't just structures, they're dreams made concrete." The world seemed to slow down as Robert Sterling continued speaking. "I'm offering you a position as Senior Project Architect with Sterling Development Group. The salary would be sufficient to allow you to relocate closer to your children in Oregon and pursue joint custody if you choose. You'd be designing the kind of buildings you dreamed about, projects that matter, that last, that change communities." Jake's vision blurred as the magnitude of what he was hearing hit him like a physical blow. That's impossible. You can't just offer someone a job because your daughters stayed at their house for one night." "You're right," Robert said with a laugh that held no mockery, only warmth. I can't. That's not how business works. But I can offer a job to someone whose character has been thoroughly tested and proven. Do you know what my daughters told me about that night? Jake shook his head, unable to speak. They told me about a man who had every reason to be bitter, who was struggling to keep his head above water, who could barely afford to heat his own home, and who still opened his door to strangers in a storm. They told me about someone who shared his food, his shelter, his story, without asking for anything in return. Amanda wiped her eyes, but her voice was steady. Dad builds more than buildings, Jake. He builds teams, communities, futures. And has spent his whole life looking for people who understand that success means nothing if you don't lift others up with you. We weren't stranded by accident that night, Samantha admitted, her cheeks flushing slightly. Well, the car really did break down, but we were in your neighborhood because Dad's been looking at developing some properties in this area. We'd been driving around for hours, getting a feel for the community. Robert nodded. When their car died and they started knocking on doors, it became an unintentional test of the neighborhood's character. 17 houses, Mr. Sullivan. They knocked on 17 doors before yours. 17 families who looked out their peepholes and decided not to get involved. Jake felt tears streaming down his face as the full impact hit him. How close he'd come to being number 18. How easily he could have looked through that peephole and decided he had enough problems of his own. But there's more, Robert continued, reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a folder. Sterling Development Group sponsors a comprehensive scholarship fund for children of employees. Danny and Sophie would qualify for full college scholarships when the time comes, plus tutoring support, summer programs, whatever they need to succeed. The folder slipped from Jake's numb fingers, papers scattering across his doorstep like snow. He sank down onto his front step, his legs finally giving out completely. The sobs came from somewhere deep in his chest, 3 years of held-back pain and desperate hope finally breaking free. Why? He whispered through his tears. Why would you do this for a stranger? Amanda knelt beside him, her hand gentle on his shoulder. Because you weren't a stranger to us when it mattered most. You were family.